My name is Dr. Wally Seward. I'm the Director of Civic Engagement for Focus St. Louis. It is an absolute honor and a privilege to be moderating this conversation here tonight. I want to thank Forward through Ferguson and, of course, the Missouri History Museum as co-sponsors of this event, and thank you all for being here tonight. It's difficult to overstate the attention that criminal justice reform has received nationally and locally in recent years. And St. Louis has become an epicenter of this modern reform movement, which is why I'm so very happy to welcome to the stage St. Louis County Prosecuting Attorney Wesley Bell, St. Louis City Circuit Attorney Kim Gardner, U.S. Attorney for Eastern Missouri Jensen, and St. Charles County Prosecuting Attorney Tim Lohmar in alphabetical order. Let's give them a warm welcome. One of the things that I've noticed is that unfortunately conversations about this issue about criminal justice often devolve into a kind of two-sided debate, into a false dichotomy, right? Are you pro-cop, anti-cop, pro-law enforcement, anti-law enforcement? And in fact, people have different reactions when faced with an image like this. And this is the one thing you can't see on your monitor, so feel free to turn around. I've got one picture. So people have different reactions, right? Depending on where you are, often people will empathize with one side or the other. We hope to step past that dichotomy tonight. As a public ethicist, it is my goal always to find the balance of considerations in any particular issue or controversial question. And the two fundamental points I'd like to make tonight about the two sides of this debate are the following. There are truths on both sides of this debate. And I call them the two legacies, starting first with the historical and ongoing legacy of profound self-sacrifice and public service by individuals who serve in criminal justice institutions, the police on the front lines, the prosecutors, the defending attorneys, the judges, the correctional officers, all of the support staff. All of them don't get into this because of the stress-free work environment, high pay, and easy money, right? They get into it because of a love for service. That's one side of this equation, and one we want to recognize. The other side of the equation is also true. There's a historical legacy, an ongoing legacy of deeply unjust racial disparities in the use of violent government force. Our country has a history of this by both individuals and institutions in the criminal justice system. Both of these things are true. At the same time, that's what makes being a prosecutor or being someone in the criminal justice space such a difficult place to be. The role of prosecutor, of course, is difficult because you don't have the luxury of choosing sides in this debate. You need the full cooperation of the police force in order to do your job, but you also have to turn around and provide that oversight to the police in cases of alleged misconduct. And of course, you have to do this all in the harsh glare of the media cameras. So I don't envy your job. I appreciate your being here tonight. The final point I will make is that making questions of justice in criminal procedures even more pressing and difficult is, of course, the fact that, especially here in St. Louis, it's inextricably linked to questions of racial justice and racial equity. And we're not talking just about the attitudes of individuals. We're also talking about the kind of intergenerational institutional racism that doesn't require active hate, only passive maintenance of a status quo built on generations of racial disparities. All of these things make this job so difficult. So, with that frame, I would like to go ahead and ask the first question. If we can go ahead and switch the screen over to the tweet wall at this point. My first question to the entire panel is a two-part question. And I'll start right here and by the way, all of the panelists kindly agreed to be on a first-name basis, so I don't have to figure out circuit attorney, prosecuting attorney, and the various titles. Thank you. So I will start with Jeff immediately here to my left. Forward Through Ferguson has set a goal of achieving a racially equitable St. Louis by the year 2039, 25 years after the killing of Michael Brown. If you imagine a prosecutor's office operating in the most effective and racially just manner possible on that date, how would that look different than what is happening today, if it does? And what steps would you be open to taking now to move us in that direction?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here tonight. I very much appreciate this opportunity. I'm Jeff Jensen, the U.S. Attorney, so oversee the federal prosecutors in this area. To be honest, I wouldn't do anything differently in the U.S. Attorney's Office than what we're doing right now from a prosecution standpoint. We honestly aggressively target federal gun crimes, and we will continue to do that regardless of race. We target people we believe are active shooters based on the information we have. We target crimes that are closely related to violent crime, and we target certain distressed areas where the community is asking for our federal resources to come in and help to rid those areas of the crime that people are having to tolerate and unable to sit on their front porches without fear of harm. So from a prosecution standpoint, we are completely 100% race neutral. We just go after the crime. What I think we could do much better, and what we're trying to do much better, is to work more closely with community organizations so that we're not just prosecuting in high crime areas and individuals who are committing these crimes, but we're also trying to build up the community at the same time. So we meet frequently, my office, actually we all meet together with the heads of the federal agencies, the police heads, and more importantly, we meet with community support organizations that try to build up those distressed neighborhoods, including the Urban League with their Save Our Sons program. We meet a lot with Better Family Life and all the de-escalations they do, the Demetrius Johnson Foundation. We all, in the Clergy Coalition, we sit in a room, we have open, honest discussions about how can we holistically improve these neighborhoods. But I believe an important part of that is prosecuting violent crime, and we will continue to do that. So again, from a prosecution standpoint, I wouldn't do anything differently. From a building the community standpoint, I think we've got work to do, and we're trying.
Wesley, after you, question is, what would you like your office to look like in 2039, and what are the steps to take us there?
In 2039, you know, what we've been doing and what we've started doing in the 23 days now I've been in office. So we got a lot of information to fall back on now. And so we have to start addressing the root causes of not only crime, but socioeconomic disparities, and much of it connects back to poverty. When you look at how the justice system works for those of means as opposed to those without means, there's a clear dichotomy, and we have to start being honest about the conversations that we're having and the way that we're approaching prosecution on this level, but in addition to that, also recognizing that there's a social economic side to addressing crime as well, and so we can't just be in our silos looking at, well, we're going to prosecute. We also have to look at diversion programs. We have to look at drug treatment and mental health treatment programs, because many of the low-level offenders turn into the violent offenders. And if we don't address that root cause, we're just going to keep spinning our wheels and fighting the same war over and over. And so what we're looking to do and what we've done is to start partnering with community partners such as Affinia, such as Places for People, such as BJC, who's already been working with the county, other organizations, even outside groups, Malincrop being an example, so that we can expand these programs and offer more individualized programs so we can take those nonviolent offenders and prevent them from becoming the violent offenders. And last, I'll say, I look at my role not only as keeping St. Louis safe, but also regionally, and how we start attracting businesses, how we start attracting families. And if we're behind the curve, we're going to continue to be a place that loses population. But if we start addressing these issues, get in front of the curb, then we'll start being a destination city, destination region once again. And so I think that all of us, and I think everyone on this stage, sees our role in those ways. And I mean, I could go on, but I think we have to at least start with those issues.
All right. Kim?
First of all, thank you for allowing me to be here amongst the individuals I work with on a daily basis. So I thank you guys for being here. But what I would like to see for the prosecutor's office is what I've done. From day one, when I took office 2 years ago, we started and we implemented diversion programs. I look at crime on a continuum. Crime is a public health crisis, and how we look at crime and how we deal with the root causes is that we have to look at diversion not as a choice, but as a requirement for public safety and harm reduction. We looked at how we expanded our misdemeanor redirect programs, how we created a young offenders program. We have a drug offenders program run by the Prosecutor's office. How do we expand social services, not just outside in the city of St. Louis or the region, but what we found, criminally infected individuals, we have to have those services within the Prosecutor's office because we need to have trauma-informed counseling, which we've done from day one to bring into our office. At the same time, we have to look at the source of crime is lack of opportunity and hopelessness. To address that, we've put Slate inside our office to give people the job training skills, the educational attainment that we are dealing with as prosecutors, not just the charge itself, but the root causes of crime, the lack of education, lack of mental health services, lack of opportunity. So we're addressing those inside our office. We're bringing counselors inside our office. So I would like to see a prosecutor's office that is staffed not just as a prosecutor's office, but as a social service office and a public health office. Also, what we looked at is how do we take those nonviolent offenders and instead of having a brush with the criminal justice system that causes more harm, we reduce harm by giving them a true alternative to get them back on track. So we can focus our resources on the serious and violent crime. When we talk about diversion, we're not talking about sacrificing public safety. We're talking about focusing our true resources on the more serious cases. At the same time, to focus our resources on the crime drivers, we like to say, we want to look at how we can use data. I would love to have an office that has the infrastructure like we've implemented since my 2 years to make better data-driven prosecutor decisions. We use data in terms of how we work with New York Law School, how we're going to use IA to actually make the better decisions so we can prosecute the crime drivers, how we can make better decisions as prosecutors, how do we address alternatives, but at the same time, we have to address those individuals that are causing havoc on our community, that are causing the problems. What we like to talk about is stopping the victimization of criminal defendants. A victim today, a criminal defendant tomorrow, and vice versa. So we have to interrupt that victimization. And how do we do that? It's not simply by arresting our way out of this or prosecuting our way out of this. It's actually addressing crime in this way. We also want to strengthen our victim services. Right now, I would love to see a prosecutor's office to focus on victims and witnesses. We have very limited resources, so we have a prosecutor's office that gives the victims the help, gives them the tools, so this engagement with the criminal justice system is not a downward spiral. But at the same time, we have to make sure that nonviolent offenders are not subjected by this interaction with the criminal justice system in any way to be basically a lifetime sentence. So this is what we're doing, and this is what I would like to see for the future.
All right. Tim, significantly smaller African-American population in your county than other places. Do you like to answer that question?
Sure, thank you. Great to be with you guys. It's an honor to be with these, all three of these friends of mine. I learn from each of you guys all the time. Coming from St. Charles, we've got a long history in the criminal justice system of high sentences, juries who will go over and above what our recommendations may have been. More recently, I think we've taken what I feel is the more appropriate approach. It didn't start with me, started with my predecessor, but it's certainly something that we've carried on and I think we've improved upon. We recognize that addictions, socioeconomic issues, mental health in particular, that's a huge black hole in the criminal justice system. Those are all factors that contribute to crime. And so we realized, I could probably convince a jury to give somebody a significant sentence, but we all know that they're not going to serve the majority of that sentence, and they'll get out eventually, and then they'll go right back to the community in which they grew up. And unless we've given them any sort of tools to equip themselves to become more productive citizens, they're going to go right back into the cycle of criminal activity. So moving forward, we are going to continue to look at alternatives as far as diversion programs. Treatment courts are a huge aspect of what we're trying to do. We've expanded that to include any first-time nonviolent offense that involves a substance abuse, whether that's burglary, a forgery, anything like that. So we're trying to expand that in an effort to keep people from getting caught up in the system.
Thank you very much. So what I'd like to do next is I'm going to ask a question of each of you individually and ask the other three. If you want to weigh in on one of the other questions, make yourself some notes. I'll give you a chance once I've gotten through all four of you to do that. And Jeff, I'm going to put you on the spot one more time and start with you right over here. In 2018, in an article in the Riverfront Times, you pointed to close coordination between your office and that of Circuit Attorney Gardner. At the same time, the criminal caseload in your office for the first half of 2018 was almost double that of 2017, and including a big increases, and you've already mentioned the gun cases, including that is a big piece of that increase. As a piece of that puzzle, you've also pointed out in the past that some defendants might be better off in the federal system, given that there are better post-incarceration support services and a significantly lower rearrest rate for that population, despite the fact that they're a higher risk pool of defendants. Can you go a little bit more in detail about how some of these partnerships work? I think there's a lot of folks in the audience that'd like to know how you partner with local prosecutors to help take a load off their desk, if that's appropriate, or help with resources and bring the federal partnership to play here. And also, you guys have been making news day in and day out, so I've had to adjust these. I think it was yesterday, you announced a partnership with Attorney General Eric Schmidt on the focus on violent crime. If you could include that as part of that answer. How exactly really do the feds, a little more in detail, work with the local prosecutors?
That was quite a question.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, with respect to the article and working with Kim and with Wesley and Tim, I mean, for example, Kim's office and my office, we meet, I don't know if it's more than weekly. There are constant communications between her office and the U.S. Attorney's office about where cases should go. There are some crimes that are purely federal. There are some that are purely state. I would say the majority, or a large chunk of them, could either be prosecuted in state court or federal court. And then therefore we have to make a decision. In federal court, there are better resources for the probation office. So it makes sense sometimes to get people into federal court. The probation office in the Eastern District of Missouri is the most successful in the country, and I have absolutely nothing to do with that. That's not me. That's actually Scott Anders, who's in charge of the probation office, and that's an arm of the court. But they have a 7.5% recidivism rate after people get done with the federal system, which is about 10 times better than the national average. So it's just shockingly impressive. They get there in a number of different ways. We have reentry courts for people with mental health issues. We have a veterans court. We have a drug court, people with addiction issues as they're coming out. And we have a gang court. So as people are coming out of federal prison, not just people that were in gangs, but based on information we have from the Bureau of Prisons, we anticipate they're going back into a gang as soon as they get out. And so we put them in these specialized courts where they receive very intense supervision, typically in exchange for some of the time that they'll have to be under court supervision. We also have a diversion court for people coming in if they have a problem that we think we can work with. So it's that probation office and getting people jobs. Their unemployment rate is about 4.5%. For people in the Eastern District of Missouri, they get jobs with the Carpenters Union, the welders, certified nurse assistants, commercial driver's licenses, because the jobs are what are stopping the bullets. That's the way to stop the violent crime, is to get people jobs that they can be proud of, as opposed to working at a fast food place where they're just trying to work so that they can keep their PO off their back. They have a job where they can come home and be proud, and then that makes intergenerational change. We're trying to measure that now. It's difficult to measure the intergenerational change, but at least anecdotally you see it, where entire families are reformed by the work that they're doing. So we do try to pick up quite a few cases, and we meet constantly about where the best place to prosecute those cases are. With respect to General Schmidt and my announcement yesterday, I'm very appreciative of that. We want to give our federal resources in areas where there are high crime rates and people are asking for our assistance to come into those distressed neighborhoods. We can always use more assistance prosecuting cases. He's going to give us 3 to 5 prosecutors that will then deputize as federal prosecutors to keep working in the high crime areas, and again, try to get people into this system that's working with the resources it has and is the best in the country. And I say that 7.5% and the 4.5% for recidivism and unemployment respectively, that also is in light of the fact that we have the highest risk group of clientele in federal court here than any other district, based on all the measurements used by the government when they're measuring risks of defendants as they're coming out. So I think I answered all,
I think so.
all or most
Absolutely.
of it, right?
Well done.
I may have forgotten parts, I don't know.
But there's been a lot going on, so pardon the length of the questions. Kim, I'm going to go to you next. Two things have happened recently related to your use of what's often called a Brady List. And that's a list of police officers you believe are ethically compromised to the point where you cannot in good faith accept evidence and testimony from them. The first thing that's happened is a national coalition of over 50 law enforcement officials, including police chiefs and sheriffs, have signed a statement in support of your use of the Brady List and legitimized it as a tool used by prosecutors around the country. The second thing that's happened, and correct me on some of these facts if I have anything wrong, a group of officers from the SLMPD brought a significant narcotics case to you, which depended on evidence provided by one of the officers on the list. They secretly videotaped your staff declining to prosecute, and then that video was somehow leaked to the press, who spun it as a week-on-crime story. Therefore, it seems that the Brady List is both a legitimate tool for holding police accountable and possibly a significant barrier to cooperation from parts of the police force. And I just ask you to speak to how you plan to effectively use that Brady List in the future. And it's, of course, entirely appropriate that you have not spoken about who is on the list or specifically why any one person is on the list. But if you could talk a little bit about the kind of things that might put an officer on the list so we understand what that thinking is, that would be appreciated.
Thank you. That's a very difficult question for me right now because, as you know, I'm under a temporary restraining order to talk about specifics of that list. But I will give you the general overview of what has been in the public concerning the exclusion list, or what other individuals call a Brady List. As a prosecutor of the city of St. Louis, I have the utmost duty to defend the integrity of the criminal justice system, and that includes reviewing the work of police department and police officers. The Brady List, or the exclusion list, as you heard and you said, 55 individuals around this country basically stated that this is done in every jurisdiction. So why is it that St. Louis City in our region has problems with defending the integrity of the criminal justice system? That is crucial to a prosecutor and how we proceed with any type of case. And so the overview, credibility of an officer is key to the integrity of the criminal justice system. Well, the ultimate incident that everyone heard, I guess, last week about an officer taping our office, one of the problems is that officers are deciding to take matters in their own hands. They're going to circumvent the system, and they're going to spin this conversation that somehow we're dropping cases. Well, we have articulated to supervisors, the upper management of the police department, the chief, and everyone involved that these officers are on the list, and credibility is a non-negotiable factor. And that's my job as a prosecutor. So they understand that they are not allowed to bring cases to the warrant office at that time. Individuals know why they're on this list. I cannot go into specific details, but what is most concerning is that we have the message and the rhetoric driven by the St. Louis Police Officer Association Union that is one of the most aggressive unions in this country. We also have an individual who leads that union. I don't like to call people out, but when we talk about the relationship with my office and the police, it's actually a great relationship. We're gonna always have push and pull. If you ever hear of a prosecutor having a great relationship with anyone, that's a problem. You're gonna make people in the community mad. You're gonna make people in the police department mad. You're gonna make people inside your office mad. So if you have a prosecutor that everybody likes, they're not doing their job. And so, unfortunately, I like to win a popularity contest, but I think in this position I will not. But at the same time, we have to stop non-credible officers from presenting cases. And we heard, we're not going to get into the details, just, for example, the 4 officers that were indicted in the federal system. I mean, that tears down the fabric of the credibility and the integrity of the whole system. See, people think it's a case. it's not just a case, it's the whole system that's affected when we, as prosecutors, do not take a bright line stand about non-credible individuals. A police officer is no different than a non-credible witness, and we make decisions every day whether to use that witness or not. So based on that person's occupation, why are they treated any differently? So we have to make sure we hold everybody accountable, even police officers. And I just want to say, you know, since the individual who calls me out, I don't like to say his name, who was the leader of the police union, but Wesley, you have to deal with him in another way, unfortunately.
I knew that was coming.
Unfortunately, but he was also a police officer that was fired for making a false police report. So we have to change the rhetoric. Prosecutors have to make tough decisions, but at the same time, we have to defend the integrity of the criminal justice system. And so I support Brady List around this country as well as the exclusion list. And I look forward to working with the police department to solve whatever problems we have regarding individuals, but at the same time, I have to do my job.
You made a point there that I really like as a public ethicist that I often make, which is, and I think is true about government in general, if governing is easy, watch out, something's gone very, very wrong. I think that's a good point. Tim, I'll move on to you. One of the key elements of the current focus on criminal justice reform is decarceration. The goal of reducing our jail and prison populations is one that crosses party lines. Governor Parson received one of the loudest standing ovations of his State of the State address when he told lawmakers he's not interested in building more prisons, and has recently announced the closure of the Crossroads Correctional Facility. Deeply Republican states like Texas are leading the way in terms of reducing prison populations. Can you speak to whether you see this as a priority, and what changes, if any, would you be open to making to help begin reducing the level of incarcerated Americans in our state?
Well, that is a fine question, Wally. Thanks for the opportunity to answer that. Yeah, I think we are naive to assume that everybody who is in prison belongs there. I think the historical law and order viewpoint would have led you to believe that. We're past that. We're moving past that. Even in conservative communities like St. Charles County or outstate Missouri, what we need to do, in my view, is sensible criminal justice reform, and that is almost exclusively focused on the front end, keeping people out of the system. As most of us know, the majority of people who are in our prison system in the state are either violent offenders, that everybody agrees should be there anyway for the safety of the community, or people who have been in and out of trouble over and over again. I'm not naive to say that there are certain people in there who might be first-time non-violent offenders. I know that's a fact, but I'm not opposed to the idea. In fact, I embrace the idea that we need to look at mental health on the front end. We need to look at diversion programs. We've got to look at treatment court options. We employ those on a daily basis in St. Charles, much the same way Wes and Kim and Jeff does to a certain extent. So I think it is a real problem, and I come from a very conservative jurisdiction that I think also realizes that if we say, let's keep doing things the same way just because we've always been doing it, that's not the right way to look at it.
Thank you very much. That was quite an answer to quite a question. Appreciate it. Wesley, you're the last. Being the most recent office holder on stage, I'd like you to speak to the following. During your campaign, when questioned about being a judge in the municipal court, one of the points you made is that it can sometimes be difficult to see the injustice of a system from the inside. And I would add that systems are also inherently resistant to change unless under great pressure. So in terms of now having moved from kind of opposition into the seat of power in the prosecutor's office, what has changed for you since then? And how do you make sure that you use your position to make the necessary changes? In other words, how do you intend to balance being in the seat of power with the reform mandate that voters put you in office with?
Okay, I was expecting a union question.
Sorry. We can go there if you want.
Happy to. You know, I think that just like everyone in this room, we are all products of our experiences and the lessons that we've learned. And I think I probably speak for just about everyone in this room that for years, generations, I think no one really saw the how large this problem was, the complexity of this issue. And I think a lot of us were in our silos, and most attorneys are in a few courts, and you see the things that are right or wrong in those particular courts, and you want to change those things. But the scope, I think, is what I think, a lot of the Department of Justice investigation, a lot of people started realizing that there was a real issue, a much larger issue than we thought. And what we initially thought was St. Louis County, we see it statewide, we see it nationwide. And so, like most young attorneys, I wanted to be a judge one day, because I'm thinking, where else can I effectuate change than on the bench? And once I became a judge, it didn't take me long to figure out that it's really the prosecutor's office who has the most sway. By the time the case comes to me, 90+% of them are already resolved. And so when I wanted to be this benevolent person that's treating people fairly, by the time it came to me, well, there's already a deal, fines, et cetera, and things of that nature. And so I started transitioning into the prosecutorial side, and I actually stepped down from the bench so I could focus on the prosecutorial side because I cared about how we approach these issues and how we can really effectuate change. And then there's another a little stop along my path. I was hired at St. Louis Community College, and I think, like most people know, there's nothing like living close to work, right? And so I moved to Ferguson, and then a few years later, Ferguson became quote unquote Ferguson. And so I decided to put my hat in the ring. I felt like with my background, with my experience, I needed to get in the fray. I needed to be a part of the solution. And so that was a learning experience. Working with the Department of Justice and I should clarify, working with President Obama's Department of Justice. That's important for me. We got an opportunity to work with some of the best and brightest attorneys in the country, but also to get a feel for what is going on outside of our region. Because sometimes we're used to our culture. All of us went to law school and we came up in a certain culture. And that was one of the light switch moments for me, was to be able to sit there and really evaluate the things that were going on in our region. And it opened my eyes to a lot of different things. And so just like in Ferguson, I just don't, I understand that change is slow. I get that. That's going to happen, and that's unfortunate in some cases. But there are opportunities when we know what's right to move on it. And so some people said, well, you could have waited to implement some of these policies, but I don't really understand that when we know that we want to end debtors' prisons. We want to stop prosecuting poverty. And one day longer is too long. And so so I look at my experiences as what brought me to this point, and few people had the opportunity to disseminate justice from every level. And it's different when you're looking at someone in the eye who just needs a break, who deserves a break, who they're coming to court scruffy because they just got off work and they had to take 3 buses to get there. And sometimes we look down on that person because we see someone else come in a suit and we think, oh, well, they really care. Well, it's not that necessarily that they don't care. I mean, and if you wear a suit, that's great to come to court. But, there are people who had to struggle, who are trying to make ends meet. And we also have to take that into consideration. And so, I'm a product of all those experiences, and I'm proud of those experiences, and I will move forward as a result of those experiences.
Wally, can I just say one thing?
Sure. In fact, I'd like to invite all the panelists at this point. I've kind of gone through each of you with a question. If you want to weigh in on something else that's been said here in the last round, Tim, after you.
So I just want to say, Wes and I had lunch, I don't know, October maybe. We were talking about transition, because I've only been here for 7 years, and so, and Kim and I had a similar meeting when she first took office. And I remember telling Wes, I said, hey, I gave him all sorts of really good advice, I'm sure, right? Yeah. I did teach him how to dress, as you can tell. No. But I said to him, hey, there's one piece of advice I would give you, and this is so important. Of course, you're going to go in there and make change. But go in there, wait a little while before you roll that change out. And what does he do? He rolls change out day 2. But you know what I just learned right there? That makes sense. I get it. So, thank you.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that little round of questions there before I move on? Kim?
Well, just to even talk about when Mr. Bell talks about being a part of the system, I want to clarify from day one, even being an assistant circuit attorney, a prosecutor, being a defense attorney in private practice, I went to the legislator. So I was one of the rare individuals who believed in debtor's prison, understood debtor's prison, and filed legislation to eliminate debtor's prisons before the Mike Brown unfortunate incident. And that's in 2012. So I understood the system, whether as a prosecutor, and this is not an indictment on anyone who was a part of the system, but we also have to understand, to change the system, you have to understand that we're all a part of it, from public defenders to private attorneys to prosecutors as well as judges. But we have to understand that there is debtor prisons, and we all knew that that was an issue. So I had the opportunity to serve in the legislature and to represent the 77th district, represent the North City where I came from, where you saw individuals that looked like me who are affected from the system and understood that debtor's prison is real, representing those individuals that will go into any municipality or the city of St. Louis municipal courts before change, that they were basically overcharged for low-level infractions. So we have to look at that. So, you know, I don't want everybody to think because you are a part of a system as a prosecutor that you can't make changes. But at the same time, you know, I appreciate Mr. Lohmar when he gave me advice, because I took the chance and the time to really look at my office, to study what can be done. Because when you look at changing a system that's been around for decades, you know, you cannot make changes rapidly. And so I hopefully that Mr. Lohmar and his changes, as well as my changes in the 2 years, gave Mr. Bell the opportunity to do the things that he's doing.
No, but we like lively conversation. I mean, this is what I think folks are hoping to hear. What's in your mind as you're working your way through these issues in the public space? So for the audience, I'm going to ask 1 or 2 more questions, but in about 15 minutes, my colleagues in the back here are going to start collecting questions and bring them up to me from the audience. So make sure if you want to ask a question, go ahead and tweet it out. And or we've got some of those postcards. If you are not yet a tweeter, go ahead and write that down and get that in. Just wanted to give you notice about that. So I've got another question I'd like to address to the panel as a whole. This morning's sad news about the shooting death of an off-duty St. Louis police officer named Catlin Alex at the hands of 2 on-duty police officers has once again underscored the point that police officers are human like the rest of us, who bring all of their personal strengths and shortcomings to the job. As a result, I'd like each of you to please speak to the specific policies, strategies, and concrete steps you could take to ensure robust, independently minded oversight in cases of alleged criminal misconduct. Of course, we don't know if anything like that is the case yet in the current shooting. We want to suspend all of our judgment, but I would like to know, from the first moment of hearing a case like this, what's the approach? What are prosecutors' offices doing to make sure that you know what has happened there? So what are those steps to ensure police accountability? And I'll throw it open to the panel, whoever wants to pick up that nice burning ball.
Wes, you got this.
You know, I believe that, you know, just like everyone in here is held accountable for their actions, law enforcement has to be held accountable as well. And we understand that that's the toughest job in the world. We get that. We have a lot of respect for law enforcement officers who are out there risking their lives. But at the same time, we all have We all have to be accountable for our actions. And I say this all the time. If an officer is accused of something and the facts show that they acted properly, even if it's unpopular, I will have that officer's back 200%. But if an officer violates someone's rights, violates the law, then they're going to be held accountable with the same intensity. And so when I look at, think about officer accountability, you know, that's an issue that was kind of it's an issue in our office with respect and with respect to the choice of the union. And so I want to be clear, because sometimes on the outside looking in, it looks like, in the way it's painted sometimes, is that there's just a bunch of division and things of that nature, and that's just not the case in our office. As a matter of fact, I see many of our attorneys in the office here, and they have done such a great job of welcoming me into the office, getting on board. I've had a really great time. Having said that, as a former union member, I was an educator and I was an NEA, a proud union member, I should say. I do believe in workers' rights to organize. However, the concern is the choice. Now, I don't know who of the prosecutors in my office who are actively in the union. Don't want to know. But what I will say is that we have a duty as prosecutors to be checks on law enforcement. And throughout this country, prosecutors are fighting the notion that we are too intertwined, too interdependent with law enforcement. And so that choice is troubling, because not only does it create a conflict, but when we look at trying to build trust between the community and law enforcement as well as the prosecutor's office, it simply is unacceptable, and I, for one, will not tolerate the choice. Now, if a Missouri Supreme Court justice rules that it is appropriate, then I'll follow the law. But that's what it'll take, because I'm so emphatic that we have to set an example in our office that we are an independent body, that we will uphold justice regardless of who the defendant is and whether they have officer in front of their names. And it's important that that appearance of impropriety, that appearance of credibility is respected and understood. And so with that said, I do got to still give a shout out, because there's several attorneys in my office and they've just done a wonderful job, and I want to commend them for how they've received me.
So just to clarify, I know we have a highly educated audience, but what you're talking about is the fact that the prosecutors in your office, once you had been elected to join a union, something which it sounds like you have absolutely no problem with in principle, but they elected to join the St. Louis Police Officers Association, which is the same union that stands up to defend police officers when they're brought up in criminal charges in front of prosecutors.
And again, not all of them.
Not all of them.
Let me clarify that. And also, again, I just want to be clear, it's not, there's no problem with organizing. The problem is the choice.
Okay.
And that's where I think we have an obligation to make certain that the public sees us as an independent body. And the unfortunate circumstance that something involving a police officer happens, hopefully it won't, but when it does, the public needs to believe that we're going to be independent, and so that's, that's my position on that.
The appearance. You make a really powerful point about not just acting correctly, but also the appearance of a propriety is so important in terms of the public's trust in law enforcement. So on that note, in terms of holding officers accountable, anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Well, I guess you're talking to me.
Not necessarily. We have several indicted under in federal court right now, so this is a ball in everybody's court.
No, I understand, but not to slight my other colleagues on this panel, because I know that they also want to hold anyone accountable for wrongdoing. But from day one, I ran on accountability of police, because I represent the voice of the people, and that has been the #1 issue in terms of building trust in the community, is being accountable, and police have to be accountable. And so from day one, I believe the local prosecutor has the accountability and has the duty to investigate officers, but at the same time, we have the duty to take over that investigation. So I introduced legislation my first year in office to create an independent investigative bureau. I look at the San Francisco models because like they had a lot of officer-involved shooting cases. When I took office, I had one officer-involved shooting case every 2.5 weeks. So we have, in St. Louis City, we have a large amount of officer-involved shooting cases. So what I want to do is create a unit, not just about officer-involved shootings, but public corruption. And those individuals specifically focus on that unit, focused on officer credibility as well as officer-involved shooting cases and public corruption. And I think that we need the resources to do that because that is crucial to addressing the issues post-Ferguson and post-Mike Brown. And so I think that that is our job. We're accountable, and I'm accountable to the people. And in this instance, with this untimely and unfortunate death of this officer, we had asked, because we do a parallel investigation in officer-involved shooting cases, I had asked for the Missouri Highway Patrol to enter with us and to work with us on this investigation for potential criminal charges.
Well, let me reiterate what was said earlier. I mean, it'd be hard for me to overstate how much I support the police officers and the agents who are out there risking their lives every day. And I've had, friends killed, and it's an extremely difficult job, and they do make mistakes. Having said that, anytime you have a large number of people doing anything, you're going to have some that break the law. That's just the way it is. And when it happens, we prosecute them. We've probably prosecuted about 10 officers since I've been in office in the last year plus.
Just out of curiosity, what would determine a federal prosecution as opposed to a state level one in the case of police?
It depends on what the conduct is. But what I think most people here are thinking about are whether police are being overly aggressive. I think that's kind of where the question is going. But we've prosecuted police officers for any number of crimes that are sometimes even unrelated to their police work. But what's federal is when somebody under the color of law, in other words, they're at work, or they're using their position as a police officer to deprive another person of their constitutional rights. That makes it federal. So in state law, it could be a simple assault. That wouldn't be a federal crime. So there are differences. But again, we look at every case just like we prosecute a CEO or a government official. We'll prosecute a police officer. It's just whether or not a crime was committed and whether we can prove it. In the officer cases, when it's an allegation of brutality, we need some things. We need first of all someone who's willing to speak to us and come into our office and talk to our office or the FBI, and that's not always the case. We need someone who's able to identify the officer against whom they're making allegations, and we need evidence to support those allegations. When we have those three things, we prosecute the case. I don't always have control over those cases. I'm not willing to cede our authority to state or local officials. We have an independent federal authority. If it's a police officer depriving someone of their constitutional rights, I'm the final say on that kind of a case. If in addition to that it's a hate crime or it's a crime of national significance, then the Department of Justice has authority over me in those cases. So it kind of depends on the case, but when I'm in charge, I give the case to extremely experienced prosecutors. Most of them have been there for decades. Unlike me, we come and go when the president changes as U.S. Attorney, but everybody else is there for their career for the most part. They've seen many, many of these cases, and they give me good advice, and we make decisions. They're not always popular, but we make them.
Would you like to add anything, Tim, or do you think it's all been said?
I'll add a different element to that. So I don't disagree with anything I've heard up here, but I also think it's important to point out that the voters have vested us with authority to make all prosecutorial decisions across the board for any sort of crimes that happen in our jurisdiction. We prosecuted in my office in 7 years. I think we have 6 or 7 officers for a variety of different misconduct. But I think it's also important to recognize the fact. I've got an office of 60 people. I've got roughly 800 and some odd officers across the county. We do know each other. You deal with these guys all the time, so you get to know each other on a personal level. So anytime there is an appearance of impropriety, as I think Wes alluded to, we have the ability to ask a presiding judge to have a special prosecutor appointed. So we've employed that tactic several times, and I think that that's been an effective way for us to address those issues.
Yeah, and I know in other cities as well, special prosecutors have been a large piece of this. One of the negatives people talk about with special prosecutors is they're coming in and starting from zero. They don't know the community, the lay of the land. So there's also a bit of a, you know, where really they're behind the 8 ball a little bit when they're coming in, but they do provide that independent viewpoint, which is important, absolutely. Okay, then I've got one more question for you, and this is probably more for Tim, Kim, and Wesley. What I've been hearing is, especially when you were talking about correcting some of the kind of institutional disparities over the course of history, is you've been talking a lot about social service, talking about behavioral health, talking about addiction issues, housing issues, transportation, employment, jobs, stop guns. So I'm going to ask you the impossible question, which is, in a land of scarce resources, would you support a county or a city budget that expands social services if it is possibly even at the cost of new traditional crime and punishment funding for policing or for prosecution? Is the front-end social service prevention so effective, or is it effective to the level at which you might actually be willing to give up some resources? And I recognize that you're all working in what you feel are under-resourced offices in order to do that. Like I said, tough question, but.
Well, it's a tough question, but I think that you have to look at the real landscape in our region, as well as the city, which I focus on. When we talk about scarce resources, in the city of St. Louis, our prosecutor's office has been underfunded historically since day one. And before me, my predecessor has always fought for increasing her budget, as well as when we look at the police budget, which is an inverse relationship that we overfund. I mean, police are underfunded, but still they're funded at a level way greater than the prosecutor's office. So I'm not saying that we should not fund police. But at the same time, I think that you have to have a social system support within the office, because I think that we're dealing with individuals in a criminal justice system that is different from individuals who are out in the community. I think we have to support the community resources, but we need a different set of resources that is within the criminal justice system, because one thing that has affected me, and I found that we have to bring these resources in-house, is that we cannot wait for 4 or 5 days to get a bed date. We can't wait 30 days to get a bed date. We have to give that person that has that mental illness right away, get them into a bed and treatment, if we want, as prosecutors, to give people an alternative. So when we talk about, you know, underfunding the prosecutor's office, I think you have to fund both of them at the level, but I think that it's imperative for a prosecutor to look at how we shift resources, like I've done in my office, where I've created a diversion unit. I've created, within my limited budget, asked for the Board of Aldermen to fund day one this unit, because that's important. But at the same time, like I said, alternatives and diversion and social services is not an option. If we want to reduce crime, and the prosecutor's job is about public safety and harm reduction, you cannot say cut prosecutors and at the same time increase just social services. We have to do both, because it goes hand in hand. And I don't know if you guys know, I am also a registered nurse, and so public health is crucial. And I lead my office not just as a prosecutor, but we have to have those public health services and resources. We can't wait. Right here, we're at the critical point. I always tell people, when people come to see me, it's like the ER, and we have to do something. We have to triage them right away. I can't wait.
I would say,
Tim?
I hope I'm never faced with having to answer that question in real life. But if I was, I think I'd tell you, yeah, I'd be all for that. Here's why. I don't think the prosecutor's office is equipped to be a social service agency. We don't have the resources to provide the services that the citizens need. To the contrary, the people that are in our system desperately need those services, and they need to come from the communities. So the more we could fund those community organizations and the more we could partner with them, the better off we're all going to be.
You know, I'm going to look at this from a different viewpoint, if you will. I think we're looking at it wrong. I think that if we focus on decreasing our prison populations with nonviolent and low-level offenders, we focus on treatment and mental health care, substance abuse for nonviolent and low-level offenders as opposed to incarceration, well, we can get the best of all worlds at this point. We can save money, we can save people at the same time. And so what we did was we actually at the first council meeting that we actually presented to the council meeting some resources that we need. But in that proposal was letting the council know how this was going to save the county money, because there's a win-win here. We know that a 5 to 6% decrease in prison populations in St. Louis County saves the county every dime that we're asking for. And the things that we're asking for are basic infrastructure, basic things that we need in order to implement these initiatives that our population is desperate for. When we look at our prosecutors, we did a comparative analysis. Our prosecutors have the highest caseloads compared to similar situated cities in the country. We're one of the lowest with respect to caseloads and things of that nature. And so think about that, how that works out practically. You have prosecutors who are now overworked. They can't give the attention to the serious and violent crimes that they need to. And so you can see how that can affect that working line prosecutor in the office. Now, let's change that up. We start adding prosecutors, focusing more on violent and serious crimes, implementing partnerships with community partners to start saving us money, because the partnerships that we've introduced aren't costing taxpayers one dime. The programs that we're working with Affinia, the programs that we're working with for Places with People. I see Joe right here in the crowd as well. These aren't costing St. Louis Countyans, taxpayers, one dime. And I know these are things that many up here on this stage are doing as well. And so what we're looking at is rising tide floats all boats. We start giving people the tools that they need. I mean, that's a windfall for this region. We start getting people working, paying taxes, our crime rates go down. Then, that's when we can start looking at the real costs and how it affects us as residents, but prosecutors as well, but regionally. And that's how we have to start looking at these problems.
Very good, thank you. So I have seen a number of tweets at this point now about the Workhouse. So let me attempt to kind of represent that position and see and ask you to respond to it. I believe the argument from activists is essentially, number one, that the Workhouse is full of folks who don't need to be there. These are folks being held mostly, as we understand it, and it's hard to get information, in pretrial, a lot of them because they can't afford to post bail. Second, the institution itself has a long history of inhumane conditions. Third, it's very expensive. And fourth, there is some argument, although it's tough to get numbers and details on this, that if we thought about bail reform and thinking differently about cash bail, we would have plenty of space in other facilities to house the ones that wouldn't be released and that would still need to be housed in some way. So kind of stepping into their shoes, and I hope I've paraphrased the argument well, could I ask you to respond about the real possibility of closing the Workhouse?
First of all, when we talk about closing the Workhouse, one, I support anything that reduces, the need for the Workhouse in terms of people being held because they're poor. That's simply not okay. And I do support that we have to do something about the inhumane conditions of the Workhouse. But when you look at the Workhouse and the conditions, I just want to let people know, because I know activists like to say Kim Gardner is the reason for the Workhouse. I'm not the facility manager of the Workhouse. I'm not, so I'm not going to take that, okay? You need to talk to the mayor, who is over the Workhouse, and the public safety director, who is over the Workhouse. So when you talk about the conditions, that's them. Well, what I can do and what I've done is we have to look at the criminal justice system. I am one part in terms of the bail reform process, and I support bail reform. But you have to understand, prosecutors make what's called recommendations. And then it's the judges that actually decide what type of bail to set. And I agree that we have to do something, and I've done that. From day one, we've looked at how we handle misdemeanors. Most of our misdemeanors are under summonses. At the same time, we have made an active attempt to issue summonses on low-level felonies. But at the same time, a judge can decide not to do that and not take the summonses and issue a warrant. That's their discretion. So you have to understand, when you talk about bail reform, it's a way more complex system than you think. I wish I could say, yes, wave a magic wand and deal with it in my own way, it will be dealt with. But we have other partners, and I think that one thing is unfair, and I like the activists, and I support you really dealing with this issue, but I think what you're failing to realize is that people are being held in the workhouse on many different things, probation violations. They're held for many other cases that may not be in the city of St. Louis. They're held in the city of St. Louis because they're arrested in the city, but they're held for other things in jurisdictions, municipal court things. So we have to look at this system. But I also want you guys, and I support, let's have a real conversation, because when we talk about bail reform and doing away with cash bail, tell me, if you're a judge in our jurisdiction right now, people are saying that people are penalized because they're poor, right? They're held longer for bonds that are 5,000, 10%. Well, I support doing personal recogs. We need to bring that back. That means you're released on your own recognizance. At the same time, we have to look at when you have these alternatives to conditions, that's also a barrier to individuals that are poor. When we have the GPS monitoring and different things, but we have to, as prosecutors, and which I've done from day one, is looked at risk assessments, because as prosecutors, we have to articulate whether that person is a danger to public safety, because you think that someone's being held, but you have to look at the public safety and harm reduction of the community, and we have victims out here. But we have to have a better conversation, because say, for example, I know we hear this, get rid of cash bond, cash bail, and I think we should work toward that. But if you give a judge the only option of no bond or release, what do you think most of our individuals right now will have? No bond. So we create a system that's actually more egregious. So I want to sit down and have these tough conversations, but it does not happen overnight. And we have to do things. And I work with the Bail Bond Project. I work with the Vera Institute, which is a leader in terms of bail reform, because we want to, as prosecutors, to make decisions based off of data, not just close the workhouse, because we have to do something. But I also don't want to make our community even more harmful and less safe, because we're holding people for a longer period of times with no bond.
Bail reform's hard, right? Yeah.
Can I?
Wesley.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in. I'm going to answer the question a little bit differently, because I agree with Kim. One of our day one policies was changing our internal policies. We're changing the cash bail system with respect to nonviolent, low-level offenders. Now, I do want to, in the way I'm interpreting the question, another way to interpret it is the building itself. Yeah, obviously, some people have to sit and wait while for their trials, but I'm talking about the building. And I started my career as a public defender in the Special Public Defender's Office, and so I had to go in that building many times to talk to clients, and I literally would walk out of that building like shaking myself, making sure no bugs or nothing were on me. As an educator for years, I tried to get tours, because I wanted my students to see this facility that they heard about, and for years, tours were not allowed. I commend Judge Edwards for, at the very least, doing his best to try and improve the situation. You can tour it now, is my understanding. But as far as the building is concerned, and again, I try to stay in my lane because I'm in the county, but this is a regional issue, and that building needs to close. It is a horrible place, and I can only imagine if one of my family members or friends or someone had to be there for even a short period of time. Now, having said that, Kim is absolutely right. You can't just destroy it, and you got to have some solution. So that means resources would have to be set aside to build another facility. Having said that, that building needs to be shut down. It needs to be destroyed.
I'm assuming Tim and Jeff, you want to stay in your lane, not necessarily address that, or?
Yeah. Well, I don't have anything to do with the workhouse, obviously, but I mean the federal, the Bail Reform Act that we operate under in the federal system is very statutory. You won't see a bail set in the federal system at some high amount that a person cannot reach. That just doesn't happen. If bail is set, it's a bond that a person can make if bond is set, or they get detained, but they don't get detained by default because the amount is set so high. That's just the way the system works, and they get detained for one of two reasons. One, they're a risk of flight, proved by a preponderance of the evidence and decided by a federal judge, or they present a risk of danger to the community, proved by clear and convincing evidence to a federal judge. So we usually ask for it when it applies, probably 90+% of the time. If we ask for detention, we get it, because there's a real good reason that we're asking in the first place. But otherwise, the bonds are set at something that a person can make.
Then let me, I'm going to combine, I think, a couple of these questions that I'm getting from the audience a little bit and make two central points. The foundational point of which is data-supported practices. And Kim, I believe you mentioned that already. Dig into that a little bit further. The first point being that data supports the fact that criminal justice is not race neutral in this country historically, for sure. And it's pretty difficult to make an argument that criminal justice as a whole is race neutral right now. What steps would any of you be willing to take to really do hardcore data-driven approaches to A, what the problems actually are, and B, which solutions actually work in solving those problems? Not necessarily the ones that look good, but the ones that show that the data shows actually affect the populations in question. And I think this is something we can address both at the federal and the local level. So ask you to expound on that, if I could. Data-driven support for policy.
Sure. That's a really good point that Kim brought up. In fact, we've just been recently engaged in more of that, like this month, today, in fact. I think my guess is that if we do deep dive into the data, I think we're going to see some things that we probably don't want to see, that we're not proud of, and that we know need to change. My jurisdiction obviously is very different than Kim's and Wes's, and of course Jeff's mine's part of Jeff's jurisdiction. We don't have, we're very homogenous, of course, in St. Charles County. We don't have a lot of the same issues, at least to the extent that Wes and Kim do. But I think for me to sit here and say that there is no racial disparity historically, I think that would be completely naive and dead wrong. So that's why I wouldn't say that. So that's why I think we need to take from our perspective, we got to understand there's a lot more to learn, and we're open to learning and hopefully learning from my colleagues here.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Yes. Well, I mean, data is important to me because day one in my office, that is crucial and key. We as prosecutors have a lot of data that we can use to understand how we make better decisions. And I think that it's not just about the decisions we want to make, but as we hear, we have to make some of the tough decisions. So we have to also scrutinize how we're doing our job. And I think data is best fit for that. But what data does, it informs of us in terms of how do we focus our prosecution. In this city, we always talk about serious and violent crime. We want to use data to focus on those crime drivers. So I work really well with the St. Louis Police Department Intervention Compliance Unit, the ICU, which we call it. And what that unit is, they identify those crime drivers in the community. They go out, they're not simply just arresting people, they actually get to know individuals in our community, know their family structure. At the same time, they know when the individual is in and out of jail, as well as there's a young person that is also about to be a victim and affected by the criminal justice system. And as prosecutors, we need to use this data, not to just charge someone, but at the same time to interrupt the cycle of violence and violent crime. And I think we've done a good job working with the police department as well as the federal system to use our data to say, hey, we need to focus on these crime drivers. And I would like to see more use of data that we can even work on these conspiracies to commit murder. And I think that's crucial. We invited the New York School of Law. They're going to come in and they're going to do some data analysis. And actually, we have a data unit that I created in our office. And we have people who are going around looking at our data, comparing it to other jurisdictions as well as our community. But we need to do a better job. When we talk about recidivism and we talk about violent crime, I look to Milwaukee. I know we talk about the federal probation and parole system. That's one system, but the number one cause of mass incarceration is probation revocations. And so what we need to do, and we look at Milwaukee, which is a similarly situated city, they have less than 5.5% of recidivism rate, and over 79% of their cases in general, their criminal cases, is in diversion. So we know that data and that prosecution using data works. We use risk assessment in my office that's based off of data. That's not just the individual case, that's the individual circumstances, and every individual is looked at in an individual lens. So I think if we want to be about public safety and crime reduction, that's what the community elected us to do. We have to look at using data so we can focus our resources on those individuals that prey on our communities, and I think that that's crucial. But data is not just used to spout off good statistics. It's used to inform us how to do our job better, how to be more efficient. We, from day one, upgraded our infrastructure. We made sure we're working toward being a paperless office. Now, that's a hard choice in a prosecutor's office that I want to tell you, we're still in the 80s right now, you know, so we're trying to get up to the 90s, but we're focused on doing that because to be more efficient and effective and to do the things you're asking the prosecutor's office to do in terms of being that leader in bail reform, being that leader to address these serious issues, we have to be more efficient and effective, and that's what we're doing. But it takes time, it takes money, but it takes the prosecutor's office to not just be a reform-minded prosecutor, we have to be an innovative-minded prosecutor, and I think that these individuals I work well with, the feds, as well as Wesley Bell, as well as Mr. Tim Lohmar, I think that you can see that we all have different styles, but we all are doing that.
And so, you know, I'm going to echo what both of them said, but I'm just going to say, and I just want to be clear, it's all theoretical until you track the data to prove what you're saying is true. It's all theoretical until you track the data to prove what you say is true. And we can throw out all types of statistics, we can throw all types of positive stories, and that's what we tend to do. What you see in the news is we'll find one feel-good story, and that is supposed to be the rule because that's how it's reported. But it's so hard to get data, and going into the office, similar to Kim, day one, we wanted to look at where is our data, how can we improve it, and in some cases, it's impossible to find. We're just trying to find how our alternative courts were getting paid, and it took us, I mean, we still don't know 100% certain who pays for them or where it's coming from because no one knows, because no one is tracking this information. There's never been a commitment to it. And so when we're initiating when we're implementing new initiatives, I should say, if we're not tracking the data, how do we know if they're working? How do we know if they need to be improved? And so that's why it's so important to make sure that not only are we tracking the data, but what we intend to do is also make that data public for independent analysis. And so we have to, you know, there's been a historical hiding of the ball, I should say, because no one wants to see that, the bad side of it, because the good stuff, you'll see that. But the bad stuff, it's hidden. And that's not in the best interest of our residents. It's not in the best interest of our offices if we don't know what we're doing is effective. And so we're also looking for, we're working with organizations like Harpel, which everyone here works with as well. I'm not sure about you all on the federal system, but we're also looking at other ways to be able to capture that data, analyze that data. And one of the asks that we asked from the county is a data analysis, because I agree, that's something that has to be of paramount importance to us if we really truly care about what we're doing, if it's good or not.
I agree with what's been said. We use data. We're data driven to the extent we can be, but we could do much, much better. We use, I mean, just in simple ways. If there's a shot fired in an area, we use technology that triangulates down on that geographic area. Then we get the shell into a national database and find out this gun was used at this murder and this carjacking and shot this stop sign. And so we use data to react to crimes. We use data to predict risk with people as they flow through the system. It's not perfect, but it does pretty well. But there are ways where we could use it much better. I mean, just thinking of examples of things we've been working on lately is, for example, when you see an advertisement for an escort service, well, how do you know whether that advertisement is truly advertising a child that's the subject of human trafficking? And you have data analysis that can scrape the internet and combine these and pull data points and predict pretty accurately which one of those ads are actually advertising for children. So there are ways that we can do it much better than what we are, but we are, I think, doing pretty well given the resources we have. But technology is moving fast. I think it'll get better.
And speaking of moving fast, Jeff, if I could ask you a couple questions here about the First Step Act, a remarkable act of bipartisan consensus in Washington in recent times. That has changed some of the things about federal sentencing and prosecution. So what changes will the First Step Act bring to your job? And also a really interesting question that maybe everybody can talk about. Are there ways of thinking about bringing a local First Step Act into existence? How do we bring that positive national movement for reform down here to a local level? So Jeff, we'll start with you.
Right. Well, on the First Step Act, I don't want to express any opinions about it. It's not my job to have opinions about the law. It's my job to enforce them. I won't express any opinions about it. But it does dramatically change the way we work. It reduces mandatory minimums in many cases, reduces our ability to stack cases. In other words, before it passed, if someone committed a carjacking with a gun, they'd be looking at, say, a 7-year mandatory minimum. The second carjacking would be an additional 25 years. Now it's just 7 plus 7. So it reduces mandatory minimums dramatically. It also allows for people who are in prison to participate in rehabilitative programs, and by way of their participation, they can get a discount of sometimes up to 50% off of their sentence. So that's a sea change. It doesn't apply to all types of offenses, but it applies to the vast majority of them. So that's a huge change. We're still kind of working through it. We don't have our full guidance yet from DOJ, but it is going to change the way that the whole system works federally. And whether it'll be an improvement or not, we'll just have to wait and see. But again, I don't have an opinion about it. I just enforce the law.
All right. So given the...
Let me correct that. I have an opinion. I don't want to express my opinion.
I think that was implied. I appreciate that. So from that standpoint, given what we've heard a little bit about what First Step does at the federal level, would you be supportive of a legislative move either at the state or at the local level to look at these kind of things there? Does that work? Does that apply? Anyone?
Yeah, I don't think I should be opining on what the state law should look like.
I'll just say that I don't know a lot about the federal laws in terms of mandatory minimums, but I know at a state level we just don't have that many numbers of cases that there are mandatory minimums. They would be things like chronic DWI offenders or certain violent offenders. So the category of cases where there's mandatory minimums it's pretty small. You know, one of the things that I think is important to acknowledge that, you know, here our Board of Probation and Parole, they set the guidelines for when a person should be released on parole. Now, I think there's a real transparency issue there. I don't think the community has any real concept of how that's calculated. I sometimes don't even know how it's calculated in sentences. But the vast majority of people who are sentenced to first time in prison, they serve 15 to 20% on a nonviolent offense, that is. So I'm not so sure how much a First Steps Act on a state level would change what we already have in place, but I'd be open to discussion.
You know, I'm just happy to see that the momentum for criminal justice reform is now seeming to spread to the federal level as well. But, you know, I want to be clear, criminal justice reform, ending mass incarceration, those are grassroots efforts. It wasn't a top-down, it was a bottom-up. And you see so many individuals, organizations on the ground that have really been pushing for these reforms for years. And I say all the time, I didn't start this momentum, I joined this momentum, and I'm proud to be a part of changing that dichotomy and pushing for these much-needed reforms and reducing these prison populations. When you think of Missouri alone, African-American males make up about 8% of the population, but make up about 46 to 48% of the prison population. We incarcerate more women. That trend is going up higher than any other state in the country. And so, I'm very encouraged that this is a bipartisan effort, but let's make no mistakes about it. If we want to see real change, it's going to start with the people in this room continuing to push for those changes and making sure that elected officials on every level hear you loudly and clearly.
Then I'm going to slightly modify one last question from the audience and pick up on something that you said there, Wesley, which is if you are looking for change inside the office, and of course that depends on your perspective, and you would like that help from the public to put pressure on the powers that be to allow you and to help make those changes, what would your top priorities be? What are those top asks of the things you don't have control over, right? Because you're only one piece of the puzzle. What are the top asks that the public can push on for public officials and institutions that surround the prosecutor's office that would help you do your job better?
That's a great question. I think that one of the things is really educating everybody about criminal justice reform and how the prosecutor plays an important role in that reform. And I think that we have to have the public, support alternatives to incarceration and funding for that. That is just as important as funding police. When we talk about an integral law enforcement partner, the prosecutor's office is usually left out the conversation. We always talk about police, funding more police, but let's fund more of these programs and let's fund more prosecutor's office so we can do this most crucial work. At the same time, we have to help educate our law enforcement partners. We have to do a lot of education in terms of that it's all right to use discretion in how we arrest. We have to change how we engage the community. And I think the prosecutor's office has to be that person, that entity to bring people together as law enforcement, as the community, to understand that the way we have had this conversation of lack of trust with law enforcement, that affects all of our jobs. So I think that it's crucial for the community. Let's have the tough conversations, but let's have the real conversations that we all have to be held accountable, and not one entity is charged with all of the reforms. So I think that we have to talk about community engagement of police officers, as well as the engagement of prosecutors, as well as how we look at the judicial system. They are a part. I think we have to change the conversation in terms of how being on probation and parole is saving our city. The #1 driver of mass incarceration is probation and parole violations. That's the #1 way that people in the Department of Correction is in the facility. So I think we have to look at and changing the conversation that most people are not going to prison the first time. They're going in and out of the system. And it starts with the first SIS, 5 years to report. Then you're doing a life sentence where you go in and out of the system because you dropped dirty, because you can't get a job. But we have to, as prosecutors, educate the community because we have to get people back on track. And we have to educate communities that in terms of making us safe, it's only a few crimes that people are going away for the rest of their lives. So we have to understand that people are coming back out, and they're coming back out more affected, more addicted, and actually they are traumatized. So we have to have those resources for reentry, and I think that it's instrumental that the prosecutor's office be a part of that conversation because we are the ones that are dealing with when people reoffend. I think we have to, one, we have to talk about victimization and victims. We have a lot of violent instances that take place, but we have to provide more services and resources for victims. So as prosecutors, it's crucial that we get more money for witness relocation, as well as trauma services, not just for that victim, that witness, and the whole family, because we see that any brush with the criminal justice system as a witness or victim or a defendant, we don't want to keep perpetuating a downward spiral. So we have to have these conversations, and I know they sound good, criminal justice reform, but they're tough conversations. But we have to have you guys know that we are a crucial part. The police can only arrest you for 24 hours. The prosecutors are the ones that have to hold you accountable. And we have to be treated that we're an important part of the system. And we need to be funded because our offices have little resources. So we need you guys to educate the State House as well as the Board of Aldermen, the City Council. We need more money in our offices. It's not because we need more money for money's sake. We have to deal with a lot of the problems that most people do not like to talk about, and we're crucial. And so I think that highlighting the prosecutor's office and that we have a lot of discretion and educating people to allow us that we need to use our discretion and we are accountable to the people. And so hold us accountable.
Giving that good list because I had so many things and I needed time to write them down. But starting with infrastructure, in St. Louis County, we don't even have drug diversion commissioners. We have essentially a judge who has been championing our alternative courts, but we have a lack of infrastructure that we're going to have to partner with not only the county council, the county executive, but also residents.
Wesley, I'm sorry, but I just want to let you know we're just about to the end of the program, so I just want to make sure everyone gets a word in on this. I do not want to cut you off because I really like what you're saying, but I want to respect the audience and their time as well. All right. But go ahead and finish up your point.
I'll say it quick. Community organizations, education like Kim talked about, but also community engagement. We brought in a community engagement officer who is here today, Captain Clay Farmer, and his job is to engage the community, to educate, to build those bridges. Also, engaging our partners like Joe Yancey and like Dr. Holmes, who are chomping at the bit and getting involved, and also, which will make Professor LaRonda Wilson smile, implementing restorative practices so that we can make our victims whole again when appropriate. So I could say more, but I'll stop there.
All right. Jeff and Tim, what do you need from the public? We've been talking a lot about what the public needs from you. What do you need from us to help us do your job?
I mean, I'll be real quick because I'm the most limited in what I can say. I know it sounds strange, but I'm just very limited. I can't talk about existing law, policy, legislation. I'm not elected. I'm not elected like these guys, I know. They're all elected, I'm not. I'm also the only one not getting paid. So I'll be very brief. I mean, what I would ask for, what I spend a lot of time doing is talking to employers and trying to encourage them to take a chance on people coming out of whether it's state prison or federal prison. I mean, it's a good gamble. I'm telling you, there is low recidivism, at least the part I see. The employers that I talk to, it takes a while to get them there, but once they get there, they're very happy with the employees they're getting. So to the extent you have any influence over that, I'd encourage people to really take a chance on people as they come out because they've done their time, they're ready to start over, and they need that opportunity.
I would echo some things that have been said many times up here tonight. I think the biggest black hole for us in the criminal justice system is mental health. That's a huge component of the vast majority of people who find themselves incarcerated. So the more the public can be not only aware of that, but could persuade our legislators to fund those programs, I think we're all going to be better off.
Okay. Let's give our panelists a round of applause. We know your jobs are hard, and we really appreciate your giving the energy to be here tonight. Thank you all for coming tonight. Let's do one more round of applause and thanks.